Some of the most important topics that we're seeing coming out of the new UN resolution that was passed by the General Assembly by all countries unanimously in 2019. So today, what I'm going to speak about is a little bit about the resolution and why it's so important. And then we're going to specifically talk about unaccompanied and separated refugee and migrant children, which, as Lena said, has been a really important topic for us to consider over a number of years, and particularly as we see things unfolding across the world, and particularly in Afghanistan in the last few weeks, has really come to the fore again. So what I'm going to speak about today is who are unaccompanied and separated refugee and migrant children, how the UN resolution, the 2019 UN resolution, guides us in our work. It's really important why we know why are unaccompanied and separated children on the move, and to talk a little bit about the type of protection and support that they have the right to be offered. And then, as Lena said, Emma is going to give us some really, really practical examples of work on the ground for preparedness and response to children on the move later in the morning. So first and foremost, I think it's really important for us to distinguish what we mean by unaccompanied and separated children. And they might be refugees or they might be migrants. All children are migration. So I think there's sometimes some confusion with the terminology, particularly as we describe it in English. But a refugee is someone who has fled war, violence, conflict, or persecution and has crossed international border to find safety in another country. The International Organization of Migration, the IOM, defines a migrant as a person who is moving or has moved across an international border or within a state away from their usual place of residence, and regardless of their legal status, what has caused their movement or whether they have moved voluntary or involuntary. So in very simple terms, a refugee is someone who is fleeing and fear for their life. And a migrant is somebody who is crossing an international border, but they're not necessarily a refugee. And then the difference between unaccompanied and separated children. So an unaccompanied child is someone who is not accompanied by either their father or their mother or other close relatives, what we would call their legal customary caretaker. A separated child is somebody who has become separated from both either their parents or their legal and customary caregiver. And the reason why we now see this word customary caregiver is that in many countries, children may have gone to live with grandparents or other relatives, and that they may be the person who looks after them all the time. It's the person the child lives with, but there may not have been legal guardianship necessarily transferred. So they have sort of, if you like, quasi status, but not a legal status, but they are the normal person who would look after that child in everyday life. So a separated child is somebody who is not accompanied by any of these people, either their legal guardians, their legal parents, or someone else who is their normal customary caregiver. But we also know that children can become separated whilst on the move. So for instance, we know that children might be separated whilst their village is being attacked and everyone is running away or fleeing into safety, and children get separated from their families, parents, or legal customary caregivers. Sometimes there's a, you know, like we see the scenes at the moment in Kabul, where there are thousands of people trying to cross, well, it's not exactly a border, but it seems like a border getting into the airport in Kabul at the moment. But we see maybe there's an influx of many, many refugees all at the same time at borders, and they get separated. They may be forcibly separated, and we've seen this, for instance, at the USA border with Mexico. Or it may be that there is notice that even if the child is with their legal or customary caregivers, nevertheless, there is a protection concern. So there has been an assessment that maybe the caregiver is unable to offer the child the protection the child needs, or maybe, as we know, unfortunately, it is the family themselves who are the users of a child. So there are many different reasons why unaccompanied separated children may become so whilst they're also on the move. So there are many, many UN resolutions and treaties that protect the rights of refugee and migrant children, but the ones that we know are most prominent are obviously the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, and I'm going to talk about how they protect children on the move in a moment. But most importantly, what this range of seminars are that we've been facilitating through the Child Protection Network is the UN resolution that was passed by the UN General Assembly in November 2019, which was the promotion and protection of the rights of the child. And what was most important about this particular resolution for those of us working with children who may be at risk or have come into alternative care, including unaccompanied and separated children, is the fact that this new resolution was chosen to specifically focus on the prevention of separation and the protection of children if they do come into care, and also those children who leave care, or children and young people. And the whole resolution is about that topic, which is quite extraordinary, following on from the UN guidelines for the alternative care of children, which we know is also very important, and that came out as an additional guidance from the UN based on articles in the UNCRC. But then I also just want to draw attention to the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, Regular Migration, and also the Global Compact on Refugees that was adopted by member states of the UN General Assembly in 2018 in Marrakesh in Morocco. And a lot of NGOs really lobbied very, very hard to make sure that the rights of children on the move were specifically included in those global compacts. But today we're going to talk about a little bit about the UNCRC, but most particularly the 2019 UN resolution. So the 2019 UN resolution expresses deep concern regarding large and growing numbers of migrant children, particularly those who are unaccompanied or separated from their parents or primary caregivers, and may be particularly vulnerable along their journey. The UN resolution asks states to make a commitment to protect human rights of migrant children, and in particular unaccompanied children. And it also requires states to take measures to prevent and respond to the separation of children from their families in humanitarian contexts. So to place a priority on family tracing and family reunification and reintegration, and particularly to cooperate with international humanitarian and refugee organizations, and including respect for and the application of international laws and treaties. The UN resolution also requires particular protection for unaccompanied and separated children at all stages of migration. That means preventing separation, but particularly taking care of them on their journeys and at their place of final destination. And that asks states to put in place specialized procedures for their identification, referral, care, and family reunification. And by identification and referral, we'll talk a little bit more about that in my presentation, but we mean making sure we recognize unaccompanied and separated children and refer them to the respective agencies in the countries they are traveling through or arrive in. That they have access to a range of services, including healthcare and education, and most importantly, that they have access to legal assistance, that there is a right to be heard in administrative and judicial proceedings. The resolution also says that there should be swift appointment of a competent and impartial legal guardian who will make sure that the particular vulnerabilities and any possible discrimination, but also the rights of a child or a young person are addressed. And I just want to give an example of this, where there is a new law in Italy that was passed a few years ago. And I would urge people to take a look. It's called I think it's called the Tampa law, but I can check that for you. And I went to look at how this law was being implemented, particularly on the island of Sicily. And they're doing an amazing job appointing legal guardians. It used to be just a lawyer or even the mayor of a town or a village who obviously could not cope with the many unaccompanied and separated children and young people arriving in Sicily. So now they have a voluntary system where they have people who volunteer to become guardians. They're just people from the community. They are obviously have some rigorous checks on them. They go through some training, and then they have a scheme where they match them up to no more than 3 young unaccompanied separated children and young people, and they really fight for the rights of these unaccompanied separated children, to make sure that they are getting the services they require, to make sure they accompany them when they're needed, to go to maybe a lawyer's office or to take them to school for the first time. So it's a really good example of how this impartial legal guardianship is working. The UN resolution, of course, asks for protection from all forms of violence, and it asks states to provide access to sustainable solutions that are in the best interests of the child or young person. And sustainable solutions means either repatriation back to their families or communities in their countries if it's safe to do so and the child or young person wishes this, or to look at the legal possibility of staying in the country of final destination, and if necessary, going through the alternative care system within that country and through the rigorous legal processes that would either put them in alternative care or provide them with a permanent family-based situation. It also calls on all child protection authorities to promptly inform and assign that children are informed and assigned to participate in procedures for the determination of the best interests of the child once they've crossed an international border in accordance with international law. That means child protection authorities should be informed by NGOs or anybody who first comes into contact with the child, so that they have overall guardianship, if you like, and that children come into the alternative care and child protection system. It also asks that all people who are working and supporting unaccompanied separated children and all children on the move are trained appropriately. And particularly, this calls attention to people like border guards or border officials to make sure that they are aware of rights of the children and that they have child-sensitive procedures, that they prevent family separation, and that they have a child-friendly approach. And that's very, very important. And we'll talk about that again a little bit later in my presentation. But I just want to go back to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because what is quite astounding in some of the research we've done is to find that those both working in government offices, but also in NGOs across various countries, do not understand that actually all the rights of children as outlined in the Convention of the Rights of the Child cross borders. So that means if a child comes into your country, they are still entitled to all the rights under the convention. And they don't leave them like at the border. And this was quite astounding for me when we did this research, to realize that governments even don't understand that they have a mandate to make sure that the rights are upheld for all children who are on their territory. And this means also that in all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts or laws, administrative authorities or legislative bodies, the best interest of the child should always be the primary consideration. And as we know, under Article 20, children who are not living with their family are entitled to special protection assistance provided by the state. It also means that there should be no discrimination in any decisions taken for children on the move, and that state parties recognise every child has an inherent right to life. survival and development. So just to remind ourselves, the rights of children do not remain at the border, they cross borders with those children. So I think it's very, very important that when we are working to support unaccompanied and separated children on the move, we actually understand where they've come from. But before we do that, I've realized I've sort of slightly skipped something, which is we were going to do a poll. So what I'd like to do before I move on with my presentation is just to go back to Julie and ask Julie if she could kindly put up a poll for us, because I don't want to answer the questions in that poll before I move further into my presentation. So Julie, perhaps I could hand back to you for a moment.
Yes. I will just launch the poll now. So everyone should be able to see the poll and answer the question, yes or no. And the answers are still coming in, so we'll just give 1 more minute for the rest of the participants to answer. Okay, so any final answers, or else I'll be ending the poll. Okay, so I'm closing the poll now.
Okay, great. Sorry, I was so enthusiastic to get into my presentation, I forgot that. Yeah, we have to think about why are unaccompanied and separated children on the move when we're doing our work. And it's important for us to understand why children are on the move, and particularly because they face a lot of discrimination and stigma, because people are really not understanding why children and young people may be on the move, and particularly why they may be on the move themselves. And if we have this deeper understanding and we are better informed, it really means we can make much more suitable decisions for these children and look at the way that we support them, but also take on a responsibility to challenge that stigma and discrimination when we have unaccompanied and separated children on the move in our care.
And Chris, sorry, just to jump in again.
Yeah.
I only launched the first question, so should we do the second?
Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. I can't see your screen, that's the problem.
That's no problem. Okay. So sorry, everyone. I'll just, there's another question coming up. Question number 2. No, it's my fault. So
no, I've got a funny screen at the moment.
So launching the poll now, you should all be able to see the second question. And we'll just give everyone a minute. And I still see answers ticking in, so we'll just leave 10 more seconds for everyone to get the chance to answer this question. So last chance. And I'm ending the poll now. So,
Sorry.
okay, a few more answers coming in.
Yeah.
Here we go. Sorry, back to you, Chrissy. Now we have.
Thank you. No, I think I got up too early. Okay. So if we look at why children are on the move, obviously included in the reasons children leave home are escaping war and armed conflict. They're escaping from maybe abuse and violence, maybe within their own homes, within their own families, within their own communities. And we also know that, and we see this more and more and more with climate change, that there's a lot more movement due to natural disasters. And in fact, the predictions are that in the future, there will be many, many, many more people on the move, including children, because of lack of water. This is the prediction, that there will be countries now where we will see mass exodus in the future because there is no water in countries. And I think we've particularly seen that in the last few years in Latin America, for example, but we know also across some African and Asian countries. So what I'm going to do now, is, if I can make it work, is to show you a short video produced by UNHCR. And this is some children who themselves became refugees and traveled by themselves in order to flee different terrible situations. And I'm going to try and play this now. And if you can't hear the video, please let me know, because sometimes the
and we hear the sound fine.
Great. Oh, I think it stopped.
Yeah.
Sorry. Sorry, I don't know why it keeps stopping. Try again.
انقدر میترسیدم از همه چی. آمدیم در کوها تا زانوی ما پایای ما یخ زده بود، اصلا نمیتونستم راه برم. نفسم بالا نمی اومد، فکر میکردم همینجا میمیرم.
رحت ودعت رفقاتي، اجى وقفنا الجيش السوري، قلت لهم عنا شهيد بالشو اسمه، لأنه صغير شايفيني صغير لحسدوني.
The big guns that I had, I've never had before. They were looting of people's properties, killing, raping, burning of houses. All this I witnessed with my eyes.
پدر و مادر ندارم. مادرم 6 سال قبل فوت کرده. اندازه یک آدم 25-26 ساله کار میکنه. به خوابم هم همچین چیزا رو فکر نمیکردم که همچین چیزا و همچین اتفاقا پیش میفته.
Desde que me vio a mí dijo que él me llevaba hambre a mí, dijo. A esta chinita le voy a del ojo, dijo. Y cuando me quedé adentro venía él con otro muchacho y incluso los dos abusaron de mí.
نحن بس وصلنا للمياه الإقليمية وقف البلد ما عاد اشتغل. وقتها هاج البحر وصارت تشتي علينا المطر كتير. متغيرة كتير كتير كتير، ما عم بثق بحدا. إنه كيف يعني الواحد إنه أول شي الغربة بتقسي القلب، الغربة بتقسي القلب.
كبنيرون زقات منا شجر أب ليبيا 4 ورحي وفي النوم تمسك شوينا قال تامات قبر مراتي هلا ساعة مراتي
جبت معي لعبة بس ضاعت، دبدوبة للدبدب، عطوني يا رفقاتي بالمدرسة، ضيعته وإحنا عم نتهرب، ضيعته بالمي، كان في طين كتير بالأرض، وقع بالمي ما عاد شفته، كانت تحكي I love you وهيك شغلات. بعدين أهلي قنعوني عشان مستقبلك سافر وإحنا بنلحقك بعدين إن شاء الله.
So I've seen that video many, many times, and it always gets me, a particular child who lost their toy. So those are some of the children who we can see have fled terrible situations. But there are also reasons such as persecution of a particular social group. Maybe their family have political affiliations, religious beliefs. They come from minority groups within a country. We also know that there's exploitation, particularly when children come under the influence of criminals such as traffickers, and we heard that in that short video. Very often who pretend to offer opportunities, but actually deliver children into situations such as forced labour and prostitution. We know that young girls in particular flee because of early or forced marriage, and because of the stigma this can bring themselves to themselves and their family when these marriages don't work out and they want to run away. Persecution due to sexual orientation, and we hear a lot about this in countries where, for instance, being gay is illegal. But there are also family expectations. I've spoken to many young men in particular who their families have got great expectations that they will have a better future, and that they will be able to help the rest of their family, particularly their siblings, if they move to another country, because there are just no opportunities in their own communities. And that also includes economic aspirations. If you're really, really desperate and you can't feed your children, or you have a responsibility as the eldest sibling to look after your family, and there are just no opportunities whatsoever in your community. And very often this is linked with other things that are happening in a child's or a young person's life. And we know that they are moving for economic and education opportunities, but also quite a number of children are moving for family reunification. And again, that's particularly the case, as for example, in Latin America, where parents have moved up to North America, and now children are traveling to try and join them. So this is from a poll that UNICEF conducted in 2018, and it was actually done with refugee and migrant children. And quite a number of these children had travelled unaccompanied or separated. And this poll was done right around the world with children and young people. And this is the answers from those aged between 14 and 24. And it was done on mobile phones and through, so it wasn't like people going out and speaking to children. It was very, very accessible. So it was a poll that children and young people could access through their mobile phones, through their computers, and different ways through social media. But it shows that of those children and young people who answered the poll, that you can see that half of them had moved for reasons of war and conflict. 3% had moved because they wanted to be reunited with their families. 10% had moved for education opportunities, and 10% for work opportunities, and 14% because of poverty. And I think this data is really, really important because, again, as I say, in lots of countries, children and young people face a lot of stigma and discrimination because, you know, people will say, oh, they've come to take our jobs, and they should have stayed at home. But we can see from the evidence that a lot of children have no choice. They have to move. And so I'm going to show you another short film. This one was made by UNICEF. And I just have to leave my presentation because I'm going to have to go into, and I hope this works for you because I couldn't embed it. So I'm going to have to go into YouTube and see if I can get this to play for you. Julie, can you see this?
Yes, it's working, and the sound is on as well.
Great.
I was living in a village, and we were playing with my brother. It was so good village, and the things changed that the new group that's called Daesh, they come and our life became in danger, and they don't let us to continue our school. They attack on us, and my father was injured.
मैं उधर जब पाकिस्तान में था तो मैंने स्टडी छोड़ दी थी, क्यों कि घर के हालात ठीक नहीं थे और फीसें इतनी ज़्यादा थी कि कोई दे नहीं सकता था। अगर कोई पढ़ता है, कोई एमए करता है, बीएड करता है या एफएससी करता है, बीएससी करता है, तो उधर कोई फ़ायदा नहीं है।
Because our father was injured and there wasn't any place to hide in here, our life became in danger. My father decided to escape, all of our family escape from Afghanistan. I have taken a little of my clothes. It was not so good. We have travel in cars, and we have a lot of travel with our feet. We sleep in mountains and jungles.
फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल जब मैं वहाँ से पाकिस्तान से निकला था तो मैंने सफ़र किया था पहले ट्रेन में, कराची पहुँचा और उधर से मैंने एजेंट को पैसे दिए, मेरे पास थे 15,500 रुपया मैंने दिया उसको। तो उससे आगे फिर जब निकले तो फिर उन्होंने पैदल भी कोई 6-7 घंटे हमें पैदल चलने को कहा, चले भी, और फिर बाद में खाना भी कभी कभार दे देते थे, कभी देते नहीं थे।
When we were on way from Iran to Turkey, the border police of Iran attacked and pulled things on us, and when we were escaping, we lost our father, mother, and brother, sister. Up to now, we don't have any information about them, their life or their deed.
तुर्की जब इंटर हुए हैं तो उधर सेफ में उन्होंने हमें रखा है, तकरीबन 4 से 5 दिन रखा है। पैसे नहीं क्लियर हो रहे थे और पैसे क्लियर हो भी गए थे तो एजेंट नहीं छोड़ रहा था, तो वो उधर उन्होंने 1-2 दिन मारा भी, और हमसे बर्फ़ जो है ना दरवाजे के आगे, उधर काफ़ी दोगो ब्याज जो है ना बर्फ़ पड़ी हुई थी दरवाजे के आगे, तो उन्होंने कहा कि उन्होंने हमें वो दे दिए जिससे साइड पे बर्फ़ करते हैं, वो हमें दे दिए, तो काफ़ी 2-3 घंटे हमने बर्फ़ साइड पे की।
We were alone, and we decided to get our goal, that it was escape from here. We have seen a lot of problems, and we were too scared. It was sleeping in mountains, and we can't sleep until morning because it was too cold.
फिर उधर से हमारी जान छोड़ी, तो उधर से हमें उन्होंने बस पे बिठाया, तो इधर आ गए इस्तांबुल आकर हम रहे हैं 4-5 दिन, यानी कि थकावट बहुत ज़्यादा हुई थी और इस काबिल नहीं थे कि आगे आ सकें, तो इसलिए उधर 3-4 दिन रुके हैं। उधर से फिर हम आए हैं बोधनम।
I have already speak to someone in Afghanistan to cross from Turkey. It was night, but yeah, all of us was scared because it was so bad good.
मैं आया हूँ अपना मुल्क छोड़ के, कोई अगर मेरे मुल्क के हालात ठीक हों तो मेरा दिल तो नहीं चाहेगा कि मैं अपना मुल्क छोड़ूं, तो इसलिए कि वो भी मजबूर हैं, उनकी 100 मजबूरियाँ हैं, वो उधर से इधर आए हैं कि कुछ काम करें, वो अपना कुछ अच्छा अपनी बेहतरी के लिए कुछ करें, तो उनकी जो पीछे फैमिली है, बैकग्राउंड है उनका।
I'm not happy that I'm to be like a refugee. It's good to be in our own country, and it wasn't in our hand to live in our country because our life became in danger. There isn't peace. There are many dangerous people. They're like Taliban, Daesh, and many groups have come, and the people's life is in danger. They can't think about studying school and anything else. I want to continue my school study, and I want to be in future a doctor to help for people.
मैं फ़िलहाल तो इधर स्टडी करूँगा, स्टडी के साथ मैं इंजीनियरिंग करूँगा, तो इससे मैं आगे जॉब लूँगा।
The message is that live in peace and be with friends and be one hand, all of people, like brothers.
Okay, so that actually was made, that video was made in 2016, but as we can see, unfortunately, situations are not changing. So I think the other issue that's important for us to understand, and also the information to disseminate, is that not just the reasons why children are being forced and young people are being forced to move, but also where are they moving from and to, and the numbers. So this is, I'm going to go quite quickly now because I realize I've not got a lot of time left, but these are figures, updated figures from the IOM, and in 2018 there were 258 million international migrants. That's those who are migrating, including refugees and migrants. And as we can see, just over 36 million were children. But where are children on the move to and from? So it was estimated in 2020 that there were now over 280 million adults and children on the move, and that almost 14.5% of those were 19 years and younger. So we can see, yes, there is quite a lot of migration into North America, particularly as we know from the Latin American countries. But we can also see there's an awful lot of migration within regions. So if we look at Africa, the Middle East, Asia, although we see some rather large dots in Europe, we can also see that a lot of migrants and refugees are remaining within their own regions. So this is again from the IOM data sheet. The IOM has a very, very good website. It's a data migration portal, which I do urge you to look at, because it has lots of very important information, not just this sort of data, but it also has a lot of documents around different aspects related to refugee and migrants, and also unaccompanied separated children, and including quite recent reports about the number of refugees and migrants that actually go missing, that are presumed dead. And this is a big issue that hasn't been tackled a lot in the past, but now is coming to our attention more. But we can actually see, so if we look at the top figure, for instance, of Africa, we can see that if you look at the right-hand column, in 2020, there were over 40,500 international migrants coming from that region, but almost 25,500 of them remained in that region. If we look at Asia, for example, there were over 114, almost 115,000 international migrants from that region, and over 85,500 again remained in that region. So I think it's very important that we break this myth that it's mostly high-income countries that are receiving international refugees. And in fact, if we look at this, this is actually, an old chart, and I couldn't find an updated one, but this was showing refugee populations and their movements, where they were moving to in 2015, 2016, and we can see that actually at that point in time, although I think this has changed slightly in the last few years, that there were many, many refugees remaining in middle and poor income countries. So unfortunately, we don't have any accurate statistics for unaccompanied and separated children on the move. Again, IOM data of 2018 estimated there were 300,000 children who were moving across borders, who were registered in 80 countries between 2015 and 2016. But one of the difficulties is that many children are moving under the radar. They're being moved from country to country by smugglers, and so we just don't have accurate figures. Not only do we need to understand the risks while children are on the move, we really have to understand those children who come into our care, what risks they faced while they've been moving. So we know that they're extremely vulnerable to abuse, violence, and exploitation. They're very vulnerable to being moved by traffickers and smugglers. And in fact, this little chart from the UNODC in 2016 shows that in that year, there was an estimate there was 2.5 million people on the move, being moved by smugglers who had a net profit of $7 billion. It is a very, very lucrative business. And as we know, we are only catching a very, very, very tiny percentage of traffickers and smugglers. Children obviously face great physical hardships. As we heard, they have to cross mountains. We heard about how children have been detained, made to go out in the snow, but we've heard far, far worse things than that. We do know, for instance, that children coming up through sub-Saharan Africa and ending up in Libya face terrible, terrible conditions, put into state prisons and detention centres and abused and tortured, but also their journeys across the Negev desert and different deserts, for instance, are very, very, very difficult, and very often travelling for days and days without water, and facing lots of other physical hardships. Coming out of Afghanistan over the mountains, I heard of a 13-year-old boy who came out with his 10-year-old brother and his 6-year-old brother, and carried his brother on his back because their parents had been killed in Afghanistan a couple of years ago. We know that there are lots of health concerns, particularly psychosocial and mental health, but also that children face injuries on the way, that they face hostility, stigma and discrimination, that they of course lack money. Many end up working for criminals or taking on dangerous work in order to earn their passage, but also quite annoyingly, and this makes me very angry in particular, that they get very inappropriate treatment from officials, such as not just incorrect age assessment, which can make a huge difference to a child, because then they go under different legislation, different international treaties, but also that there's extortionate crossings, that they have to bribe crossing guards. They can get automatically placed in detention, and that affects things for the rest of their life, such as decisions on repatriation, sent to another country, or the issues of refoulement, where they are forced to go back to a country of origin, where they may still be in danger of persecution. They also face isolation, and I'm afraid we also hear of suicides. So what's very, very important is to consider all these issues, but also how we respond to children and young people who are unaccompanied separated, when what we call first response. And that is making sure that there's very careful identification of children as unaccompanied separated children, particularly if we think they're being trafficked or they're traveling with smugglers. And as we can see, they have very serious consequences, which can impact on the rest of their lives if this identification is not made carefully. We know that there's lots of issues with age assessment, and some countries do things like bone measurements. Others just make a decision by a border guard. It's very arbitrary. And if we don't make the correct identification, then we can really, for the rest of the trajectory of how that young person or child is treated, both legally but in other ways, can be very serious. It means they're not entitled to full care and protection of the UNCRC and other international and national laws. It can affect their care placement decisions. It means they may not be appointed a legal guardian. It also means that they may not be granted a temporary protection status, and decisions can be made about their future that are very, very different. It means they're not having the ability to exercise their rights during legal and administrative proceedings. And children are told us simple things like misspelling their names or wrong age determination has really impacted them very, very seriously. It also means they've been denied the opportunity of family reunification. They've been wrongly placed in adult reception centres and imprisoned in adult detention centres. Even if children seem to be travelling in the company of adults, it's really important we do ascertain if they're unaccompanied or separated, whether they're safe with the people that they're travelling, that they are the parent or custody legal caregiver, and to check what the relationship between the child and adult is. And we must also be very careful not to separate siblings unless there's a clear risk of abuse or other justification in the best interests of the child. Everyone who comes into contact with these children must treat them with the utmost care, dignity and respect. And we can hear in the films, that particular last film we heard, this just is not happening. Children may have encountered very fearful situations and be distrustful of adults and extremely concerned what will happen to them, and therefore may seem challenging or may seem difficult, but in fact, they just don't trust us. And a report that came out in 2017, for example, by Médecins Sans Frontières, showed that 92% of children that came into Médecins Sans Frontières services, and particularly mental health clinics in Serbia, had experienced physical violence by police and border officials in 3 EU member states. And that's just one example. So it's really important that states and NGOs apply the best interest determination and child protection case management approach. This is a photograph or a picture from the UNHCR best interest determination bid process, which is quite well known, I think, now around the world. And it shows the different steps that should be taken in order to ascertain what are the steps that should be taken in order to assure the best interest determination and response for individual children. So it's identification, the best interest assessment, which we might know as a child protection assessment or a care assessment, case planning, implementing the case planning, follow up and reviewing each child's case, and then case closure when we know that there is a sustainable and safe solution for them. So You may know this as a case management system, which is accurately assessing and responding to children's needs. Again, making sure their best interests are primary, making sure we respect the principles of do no harm and confidentiality, and most particularly ensuring full and meaningful participation of children in decisions that will affect their life, including the planning of care and support. We really need to make sure we ensure that there are steps that allow for social integration, because it's not just about making sure that we look after children's access to education or healthcare, but if they are being shunned by society, then they don't have any future opportunities in the country, particularly of the final destination. And again, I've seen some excellent projects on the island of Sicily, where I've been several times to assess the response to refugee and migrant children. And there's lots of work being done, particularly by NGOs, to ensure that there are social integration programs. So children and young people go and join in sports facilities, or young people are given opportunities to go to youth clubs or employment schemes, housing agencies, make sure that they are settled within the community. That we have interagency and multi-sectoral approach, and that we always systematically monitor each child's circumstances and make adjustments as necessary. And as I said, we'll hear more about this from Emma, particularly about preparedness and response. But we do recognise there are challenges. It's not always straightforward and easy, and we have to think about ways we can overcome these challenges. So it may be we have overwhelming numbers of children arriving into a country all at once. They may wish to remain, but they may wish to transit quite quickly. Again, there's a lot of difficulty distinguishing often between children and young adults, identifying whether they're accompanied or separated, and maybe we have lack of suitable alternative care options and the availability of other services. We may not be able to provide unaccompanied separated children with separate accommodation from adults, but this is really essential. And if we're working in communities where there is very poor access to services for all the population, then we may face additional challenges being able to integrate children who are refugee and migrants. We may also be in countries where we lack access to training for ourselves, understanding psychosocial support, understanding how to work to best support unaccompanied and separated children. And there may also be lack of coordination and cooperation between professional services, as well as situations where we might find challenging because we wish to protect and support a child, but they don't want our help, or they're frightened of taking our help. They may only want to remain with us for a few days and move on. And what do we do in those situations when we think that moving on is not in their best interest at that particular time? But we do know that we should allow them to do that. So we need to think about responding to some of these challenges. We need to look at the lack of political will to make changes, the lack of resources, including adequate numbers of well-trained personnel. Are our national laws and policies appropriate so that we safeguard the rights of these children? Are they discriminatory and harmful? For example, allowing detention of unaccompanied separated children based on their migration status. And how do we respond to these challenges together? One of the things that I wanted to end with is what is quite a shocking result, again, from this poll conducted by UNICEF in 2018. This particular analysis of these results was from 3,922 migrant and refugee children who were the ages of 14 and 24. Not only were 67% of them forced to leave their homes, but I want us to particularly look at the response in the right-hand bottom corner, which is this one. 38% of these children and young people told us that they received no help whatsoever from anyone whilst they were on their journeys. Not from family, not from friends, not from governments, and not from NGOs. That means at that point in time, which is only a few years ago, 38% of all these children who were and young people who were traveling as unaccompanied and separated refugee and migrants received no help from anybody. We were not getting them to be able to offer our services. So what we'd like to do now is to divide you into groups. to answer these 2 questions. And we're going to give you 20 minutes. And we'd like you in your groups, and Julie will be assigning you into breakout groups, so you'll automatically go into a group. We'd like you to discuss these 2 questions. And I think Julie's also going to put these 2 questions in the chat box so you can see them. If your agencies work to support unaccompanied and separated refugee and migrant children, whilst you're developing individual care and protection plans for them, do you think that you give full consideration to any previous challenges and risks these children may have faced? So all of those things we've just seen in my presentation, are they also taken into consideration when you're making the best interest determination for a child and understanding what goes into the plans to support them? And the pleasure in introducing our guest speaker for today, that is Emma Moss. Emma is a delegate working for the Danish Red Cross, and she's just arrived back in her homeland in Australia after being 3 years in Kassala in Eastern Sudan, working for the Danish Red Cross there in partnership with the Sudanese Red Crescent. And she's been specifically working on programs with migrants and refugees. In particular, the activities that Emma was involved in were programs targeting unaccompanied and separated children and also survivors of trafficking. So she has a rich knowledge that I know she's going to share with us today. And before working in international humanitarian response, Emma was actually a practicing lawyer in Australia for 7 years. And I'm sure that brought a really, really important element into the work she did, because all our work, as we're discussing today, is guided by international and national law and treaties. And so for some of us to have that grounding is really important. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Emma, and I look forward to hearing your presentation, Emma.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm really happy to be here and joining this interesting talk. So my name's Emma Moss. I've been working for the Danish Red Cross for a number of years as a delegate. Most recently, I was working in Sudan on a state which is on the border of Ethiopia and Eritrea. It's called Kassala State. Kassala State also has a city called Kassala. And yeah, so I'm just going to talk to you today quickly. Now let's see if this is going to work. Yes, great. Okay, the technology is working.
Yes, it's working.
I'm going to share with you some stories of children on the move. I'll share with you the journeys of 2 children that we came into contact with, Adana and Fitsum. I'll then very, very briefly, one slide quickly, discuss the international legal framework and the minimum standards that guide our work. Obviously, Chrissy's gone into quite a lot of detail in those, so I won't spend much time on it. Then outline the work of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement with children on the move, and then put the legal framework and standards into action. So that will be most of my talk, talking about how we responded, how we did preparedness, how we did coordination and cooperation, and how we actually did our programming and activities supported children on the move. And then finally, some reflections and learning. So this is a photo of the river, the Tekezi River, that cuts through Sudan and Ethiopia. And you can see this was taken, it's a UNHCR photo taken in November last year. And it's children who've just crossed the river from Ethiopia, from the state of Tigray, where there was conflict. So the reason, and Chrissy's already outlined these, but the reason that children are on the move in Eastern Sudan and East Africa as well are varied, and quite often they are intertwined. So children may not be moving for just one reason. There may be a variety of reasons they move. Conflict is a major one. In the area, in Horn of Africa and in Eastern Sudan. Violence, including sexual violence and exploitation. Labour migration occurs a lot in Eastern Sudan, and I'll speak a little bit about that in a moment. poverty, persecution, climate change, and also family reunification. So people whose families are already in another country, they will seek to be reunified with those other family members. So this is just a map of the Horn of Africa and East Africa. You can see Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan. And it outlines the three major migration routes out of the region, but I'll also talk about intra-regional migration. So one of the routes that people take, and children, is down to South Africa in search of labour opportunities. A lot of Ethiopians in particular, and a lot of children, youth, make the journey through Yemen and then up into Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries in search of work, young girls doing domestic work, and then young men doing different kind of labour jobs. And then we have what's called the Central Mediterranean route, which I'll discuss, and that's on the left. So that is a photo in one of the camps, refugee camps in Eastern Sudan, and that is to kind of, I guess, educate people, warn them about the dangers of the Central Mediterranean route. So the Central Mediterranean route passes from, some people are coming from Somalia, Djibouti, even further afield, and then up through Sudan, and then on to Libya, and then across the Mediterranean. It's in the years since 2011, when the conflict started in Libya, it's become particularly dangerous, and it's gained a lot of notoriety because of the deaths on the Mediterranean up to Libya. There's no real, up to Italy, there's no real numbers, concrete numbers, but it is estimated that between around 15,000 people have gone missing in the last decade and are assumed to be no longer alive. Also, we have intra-regional migration, and sometimes in Europe it may be the perspective that actually a lot of migration is out of the region, but actually the reality is that 80 to 90% of migration in Africa is interregional. In Eastern Sudan, we have every year there was about 400,000 Ethiopians crossing the border into Eastern Sudan, which was an agricultural area. They had sorghum fields and that kind of thing. And a lot of children were working there on the farms, and you'd see them walking up and down the roads like this in search of daily labour. And then we also have internal displacement. So this is a photo of, I think, 2019, when there were big floods in Sudan, and a lot of people were forced from their homes. So internal displacement is when persons or groups of people are forced or obliged to flee their home or place of residence, usually as a result of conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural and human-made disasters. But in this case, they've not crossed an international boundary. So I want to take you kind of on a journey. So this section is going to outline the risks that children on the move, the stories of two children. I just wanted to let you know that these are not the actual children's names, and to maintain the confidentiality of the children, we've kind of added and mixed up a few stories, because obviously their confidentiality is very important, but these are children that we have come into contact in our work. So Adana fled the country where she was from, Eritrea, when she was 14. Her home was close to the border, and there was military conscription for all young people in in Eritrea. So one evening she took the chance to flee. She knew that there would be a chance that she injured or killed if she escaped, because you're not allowed to leave without permission from the government, but she saw no other options. A group of smugglers offered to help her to cross the border. And then together with a large group of people, she was on a truck on a group of men, women and children. And after 1.5 days of traveling, the truck stopped in a remote desert area. Everyone assumed that they'd come to Khartoum or near Khartoum, which was the agreed destination in Sudan where they were going. But Adana told us how smuggling suddenly and very violently turned into trafficking. a new group of men arrived in a truck and they had told them that they'd been sold. The men had guns and shot them in the air. And everyone was tied up, put on a new truck and taken to a different desert clearing some miles away. The traffickers demanded $7,000 USD per person. And if they didn't hand over that money, they threatened to sell each of these people, including Adana, to some militia. At the place where they arrived to, there were another group of people, about 20 people, mainly young Eritreans, children, and they had also been trafficked. For the following days and weeks, the women and girls suffered repeated sexual violence and the men were tortured. Then, after a few weeks, out of nowhere, there was a sound of gunfire and men in uniforms appeared. Nobody knew what was going on. They were very scared. They didn't know what to think of this situation, but the men came in and told them they were from the Sudanese police, that they were rescuing them, and all of the survivors of trafficking were freed. There was probably about 30 or 40 people. And this is actually where they were taken, to the Shagarab Reception Centre. So the Shagarab camp is the biggest refugee camp in Eastern Sudan. The reception centre is very overcrowded and there are some kind of houses there, but because it's overcrowded, they've had to make this kind of, plastic kind of covering, and that's where people are living. Once she got to the Shagarab Reception Centre, because she was an unaccompanied child, she was put into the Unaccompanied Children's Centre, and that's the girls' dormitory, one of the girls' dormitories. It's quite a big centre and it has about 100 children there, sometimes up to 200 children there at a time. But once she was actually in the Unaccompanied Children's Centre, because you can walk around the camp, some of the older children can, she started getting threatened by the traffickers. They'd got into this camp, which was fairly open, and the traffickers threatened to re-traffic the young girls. So she was very frightened and she got in touch with the UNHCR protection officer in the camp and they referred her to the Kassler Safe House. So I'm just going to leave Adana's story there for a moment and discuss another young person's journey. Fitzum was 9 years old and he was living in a village in Tigray, which is a state in Ethiopia. It was harvesting time, and this is in November last year, and he was supporting his uncle after school. His mother and sister had gone to the state capital, Mekelle, to get medical treatment, and they weren't due back for a few days. There had been rumours that there were armed men in the region, but for Fitzum's 9 years, the area had been relatively safe, and he didn't believe that anything would happen. But then suddenly, while he was in the field, he heard gunshots coming from his village, and he ran into the hills and found some people from the village there. That night and for the next 5 nights, they stayed in the hills and there was gunshot and bombing all through his village. But after they got really hungry, him and another young boy decided that they would try and make it to the river, which crossed over into Sudan. It's where they had been because in between Ethiopia and Sudan, there was quite a lot of trading. So they knew where this river was. They had to go at night. There was a lot of gunfire and they saw a lot of dead bodies. They had nothing to eat most of the way and they were really hungry. But finally they made it to the river and they followed it along until they got to this place. It's a photo my colleague took, where there were hundreds of people crossing over to Sudan, to the Sudan side of the river, where they found Hamdayet Transit Centre. So you can see in these two situations that for unaccompanied and separated children, the push and pull factors can be different for each child. Whatever their motivations are to move, they are at higher risk of violence and exploitation than children travelling with parents or other groups. So just very, very briefly, the international legal framework, Chrissy's already gone over it. So we have the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention, the Refugee Convention, the Global Compacts, which are soft law, so they're guidance to states, the UN resolution, which Chrissy has gone over, and at a very practical level, the minimum standards for child protection in humanitarian action, which are kind of the practical book, the guidebook to how to do this kind of work and implement these conventions into your practical work. So a little bit about the Red Cross and Red Crescent network. So every country in the world, or most countries in the world, have a national society. In Denmark, it's the Danish Red Cross. In Sudan, it's the Sudanese Red Crescent. We also have our federation, which is kind of our mothership, if you like, based in Geneva, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is another member of our family, and they work in conflict settings. So our work is inspired by and adheres to the fundamental principles of humanitarian action. We work with migrants in recognition of their humanity, and that's irrespective of their legal status, whether they're documented, undocumented, refugees, whatever their reason is, we're there to meet their needs. We don't take any stance on whether migration should happen or shouldn't happen. We just want to address needs and reduce vulnerability wherever we find it. Now, the Red Cross and Red Crescent are not a specialised child protection agency. However, because we're responding to humanitarian need wherever it is found, this often means that we are working with children. And our role is quite often as a frontline responder, first responder, and building resilience in fragile context. And that means that when we come into contact with children, we have to refer them to specialised child protection agencies. So we do a lot of what we call safe and dignified referrals. So in 2018, the Danish Red Cross began working with the Sudanese Red Crescent in their Kassala branch. That was at the end of the Sudanese Red Crescent reached out to us and said that there was a large need that was being unmet of children who were on the move. So together we started to conduct assessments of the situation to understand the migration dynamics and what were the needs and gaps for children on the move. You can see here on the right, we literally mapped it out, the places where children were moving. You can see we've got Ethiopia, Eritrea, Gadaref State, which is also in Sudan, and Kassala State. And we went from location to location. On the left, we have, it's a border crossing point where the Sudanese Red Crescent had a health centre, and that's what's called Hamdayet Reception Centre, which I'll talk about later. One of the main things we did is we sat down and we talked to children. You can see on the top, we actually wanted to know what is your life like? What do you need in your life? What is not there? What is there? What do you like? And that's how we found out a lot about what was the situation of children. That's a group discussion we had with children in one of the refugee camps up the top. And then we're really committed, and I liked the way we're talking about psychosocial support because that's a big part of what we do. The Danish Red Cross houses the psychosocial centre, the PS Centre in Copenhagen for all of the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. We wanted to help the helper. So the first thing we did before we started activities was doing caring for staff and volunteers training for all staff who were in the field and volunteers. Sudanese Red Crescent were a big implementing partner for UNHCR. And so we wanted to make sure that we helped the helpers first. Then we did first aid training. We wanted to get all the building blocks right. We did first aid training with the Sudanese Red Crescent team, and then the main government authorities, the Commissioner of Refugees and the police. And we did psychological first aid training because our assessments found that a lot of the kind of first responders, which were the volunteers and the police, were coming across people who had been on very, very stressful journeys and were in very bad shape when our volunteers came into contact with them. And so they needed to know how to relate and help and not harm people that they were coming into contact with. So you can see down the bottom there, they're people from the local village at one of the reception centres on the border who were trained in psychological first aid. Then we really started to work on coordination and cooperation. So we facilitated an interagency child protection training, which was the starting point to strengthening coordination and cooperation amongst all the different child protection actors in Kassala State. And you can see the training was the biggest training I think that our facilitator had ever done. It was something like 40 or 50 people, but it was really amazing. It was attended by judiciary. So we had one of the prosecutors from the trafficking court, special trafficking court. We had police staff, staff from the Commission of Refugees, the Sudanese government authority, which has the mandate for refugee issues. Then we had local actors, volunteers, UNHCR, and then international organisations as well. And in Kassala, children are 50% of the refugee population, but there hadn't been a child protection training for over 5 years. And they hadn't met for a couple of years. So as well as building the capacity of attendees, it was a chance for all actors working in this space to actually meet each other and talk to each other, because they were coming into contact through their work, but they hadn't really had a forum to do that, to talk. In addition to this big training we did, we started humanitarian diplomacy, advocating for the re-establishment of the Child Protection Working Group and the Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Working Group, which had kind of fallen out of operation for a couple of years. So once we'd kind of done all these startup activities, I guess you'd call them preparedness activities, we started to, Danish Red Cross started to work. And when I say we, I'm always talking about Danish Red Cross and the Sudanese Red Crescent. We work in very close partnership. We started programming. So I'll come back now to Adana's story. Adana was admitted to the Kassala Safe House, and this is actually a photo of the female safe house. The women and the girls are doing English lessons in that photo. The safe houses were started by UNHCR in 2016 after the issue of trafficking in Eastern Sudan became very serious and prevalent. From 2018, the Sudanese Red Crescent had invited the Danish Red Cross to come help support them. So in the safe houses, UNHCR have what's called the protection mandate. They were responsible for admitting people and then saying when people were in a position where they could go into a camp or some other place where they'd be safe. And the Sudanese Red Crescent were responsible for managing the safe houses and providing all the services. So that would include mental health and psychosocial support, humanitarian assistance, so everything that somebody would need during their stay there, food, activities, sanitary napkins for girls, nappies for babies, whatever people needed, SRCS, Sudanese Red Crescent, were providing that. The social workers that we had were on duty 24 hours a day, and there was also a psychologist available. So after UNHCR made their assessment and Adana was admitted to the safe house, she slept for many, many days. At first, she didn't trust the situation. Would she really be protected? Her experience had left her scared and her trust was completely broken. But slowly she started speaking to other residents and to the social worker and psychologist, and she actually realised she was safe. I think it was mainly speaking to the other residents in the safe house that she realised she was safe, because they had also had the experience of being trafficked. The living conditions were good. She could see a doctor from the Sudanese Red Crescent whenever she wanted to, and he was well trusted by the residents, and the social workers were a daily support. She, after being admitted, she was involved in many activities. One of the hardest things about being in the safe house is being in a confined space with nothing to do. So we spent a lot of time doing recreational activities and activities that would kind of support people's well-being. She did food processing, first aid training and tailoring. She said she really loved doing hairdressing and makeup training because it helped improve her mood and she felt like she looked after herself better. She took English classes and also computer skills classes. And because of her extremely high level of protection need, she was at risk of being re-trafficked. UNHCR eventually resettled her to another country where she was further able to rebuild her life. And after she left, she says that she was really feeling safe and ready for the next steps in her life. So that's just a photo of someone doing a coffee ceremony, which is an Eritrean coffee ceremony, which is something that people really love to do in the safe house because it made them feel like they were at home. And then we'll return to Fitsum's story. So when Fitsum arrived at the Hamdayet Transit Centre, there were tents and people everywhere, and he didn't know what to do. But the Sudanese Red Crescent team leader in Hamdayet had attended the child protection training that we'd run, and she spoke Arabic and Tigrinya, so she could support a team of volunteers to immediately link up refugees with specific needs to the services they needed. You can see on the right, that's actually the Hamdayet Reception Centre. So someone like Fitsum would walk into that, and it's quite chaotic. There's people everywhere. And we had this group of volunteers in these red jackets roving around, looking for people who they felt identified as maybe needing a specific service. So Fitsum met a volunteer from the Sudanese Red Crescent, and she asked him if he needed any help. She sat down and listened to his story, and then she took him to the child protection desk which had been set up by UNHCR. A UNHCR worker who'd been trained in child protection and best interest determination and assessments sat down and talked with him, and he took his details to see if he could find if any of Fitsum family members were on the list of anyone, the people who had been registered. And his uncle had actually been registered, so he'd arrived a couple of days before, but his uncle had already moved on to the refugee camp. So Fitsum was really relieved. It meant that at least there was a family member there, and he would be put into contact with him and taken to the camp within a number of days. UNHCR also gave him a meal and a package of items such as soap and a blanket and a mat to sleep on. And then the Sudanese Red Crescent volunteer took him to the Restoring Family Links tent, which was run by the Sudanese Red Crescent and the ICRC. And I'll show you a small video about that in a moment. They let him do a free call to his mother. He had his mother's phone, and they got through into Ethiopia. The phone lines were back up in Mekelle, and she was alive. And they were extremely elated because they didn't know whether who was alive, who was not, where were they. So I'm hoping this video will work. I'm going to give it a go. Let's see if it works. This is a video of the border point that I'm talking about.
The video is showing, but there's no sound.
Okay.
You can change it in your settings to kind of broadcast your sound as well.
Emma, if you go into share screen, Emma, you'll see a little box on the left-hand side that says optimize for video and share sound.
Okay, where is that? Sorry.
If you open share screen.
Share screen. Is that in here?
If you look at the bottom of your, screen, for the Zoom meeting settings.
Oh, Zoom. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, and you go into share screen. On the left-hand side, you'll see two little boxes. One will say optimize for sharing video, and one will say share sound.
Okay, I see. Okay, and share sound. Okay, let's see how this goes.
Okay.
Give me a thumbs up if it's okay.
I'm standing at one of the main border crossings between Ethiopia and Sudan. This is the Sitit River dividing the two countries, and these people you see behind me are all Ethiopian refugees fleeing the conflict inside Ethiopia. The other side is Ethiopia. You don't see many people on that side. They tell us they are afraid to talk to the media, but at the same time they say that they really don't want to go far away from this place because it is the closest to their homes.
Stories of separation or not being able to reach family members are common here. The Sudanese Red Crescent, working in coordination with the International Committee of the Red Cross, is trying to help.
We started a program called Family Reunification. At the beginning, we allow them to call their family members for free. If that doesn't work, we send short messages via our partner agencies in Ethiopia. So far, we've conducted 2,500 phone calls and sent 86 messages. 70% of the phone calls lead to good results.
It's been 26 days since this Ethiopian woman from the city of Humera lost contact with her husband and children. She is here again to check with the Sudanese Red Crescent office for new information. Not ready to give up, she says she prefers to stay near the border, hoping that her loved ones might show up here.
Okay, so that was actually the tent that Fitzum would have gone to make the phone call to speak to his family. So that was a way in which we could ensure that families stayed together.
I'm standing.
Oops. Okay, so just some quick reflections on the work that we did in Sudan. I think it was really critical for the work we did to ensure that a proper needs and context analysis was done. As we were saying before, every context and situation is different. The reason children are moving is different. Especially speaking, consulting and co-creating with children was that critical. And it meant that we're really well placed to respond when a serious emergency occurred. Children were already at the front of our mind. Also, localised humanitarian action was critical. Training volunteers, especially young women and young mothers from the local village, was really important for us to be able to respond immediately. Because people on the border areas quite often spoke the language on the other side of the border, we had a lot of Tigrinian speakers, and that was something that really helped us in our work. For the more long-term programming that we did in the Safe House for survivors of trafficking, that required a commitment of years rather than weeks and months. And I think someone mentioned it before, but when you're dealing with this level of need, you know, where you need really specialised mental health services, or people who've been trafficked or are survivors of sexual violence, you need really, really serious technical mental health and psychosocial capacity. You can't do this kind of work in a kind of, you know, ad hoc way. You need to do a proper do no harm analysis to make sure that you do have the capacity to provide those services. And then finally, these issues are just too big for one agency to tackle on their own. You need full coordination and partnership with all actors. That includes the government, community-based organisations, UN agencies, local humanitarian actors and international actors, and of course the host community and refugees themselves. So that's everything for me. Thank you.